So good afternoon. I'm so delighted to be joined today by Mark Atkinson, the CEO of Mursion, a role he's held for 7 years, and his colleague, Sara Bokhari, who's the head of people and culture, a role that she's held for the past 3 years. The conversation that we're having today will focus on the importance of leadership in an organization, kind of leading on making a public commitment to gender equity and inclusion, that focuses on specific initiatives and targets, and the process that leadership across the organization goes through to help build out those commitments. So with that, I want to jump right in. And Mark, the first question is for you. Can you share why it's important to you as a CEO to prioritize gender and race equity at Mursion?
Well, first, thank you for doing this and for asking such thoughtful questions. And let me sort of frame my answer by just taking a moment to describe what Mursion does, because while I think the commitment that I would have as a leader would be the same, I think it's particularly important in the context of the work that Mursion does. So we have a rather unusual and extraordinary product offering. We create simulations that enable learners to practice challenging professional conversations under stressful conditions. We deliver those simulations through a blend of artificial intelligence and real human performance. In a sense, we are integrating the best of AI and the best of what humans do to bring to life challenging conversations. Well, so if you think, and if you think about the skills we work on the skills that we would sort of call human skills. We are actually helping humans practice with other humans. The irony of the way we do it is that they practice by interacting with digital avatars, but those avatars have to show up in ways that are human-like in their facial expressions, in their tone of voice, in the intuition, the offense they may take, or the frustration they may experience when someone is not interacting with them in a positive, respectful, clear way. So if you think about the goal, and by the way, one other thing I should say is we are machine learning our AI off of those human characteristics. So we're building a better AI while trying to make learners attuned to their inner empathy, essentially, in the way they interact. Well, I mean, imagine if all of us looked like me and we expected people to go out in the world. We would end up with a dysfunctional learners and a dysfunctional AI that could only represent what white men think. Since the global majority is the global majority for a good reason, those learners would fail in the spot. So it is fundamentally, we're in the empathy business. So in a way, our journey began by recognizing that if we're helping other organizations build more empathetic and understanding leaders, we had to walk that talk. Mm-hmm. And it started by building a set of cultural values that Sara led us through a process to define what our values were. And it graduated into a very deep commitment to who we represent in the world as people. So when we think about building that AI, when we think about building those avatars, when we think about designing those scenarios, and when we think about delivering them and measuring the outcome of them, we need to represent the diversity of the world in order to do justice to our learners and our clients. And so it is both a moral imperative for all the reasons it should be and a business imperative for us that we fully reflect the intersectionality of the adult world today. And so we are, as an organization, deeply committed to doing that. And it's continuous work, and we could talk more about what goes into that work, but we're proud to be involved in it, and we have a lot to learn, obviously, like everyone else.
No, that's super helpful. And I like that you highlight the fact that it is both a moral and business imperative. I do think that's critical for organizations to recognize that and think about that as they do this work. And let's jump to that next step that you just mentioned. Let's talk about the process. So how did the organization prioritize and focus your work on equity and inclusion? And I'm happy to hear, Mark, from you, but then also, Sara, let's hear your perspective on that process as well.
Well, I will throw this to Sara because she's played an extraordinary leadership role in developing our plan, organizing a team to inform that plan, and deputizing that team to actually help carry it out. So, Sara, I think I'd love for you to take the lead on that answer.
Sure. And I'll start off by actually saying that the thing that I say to my team constantly as people and culture leaders is that diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging don't live as a pipeline in our department. It's not a project. It's not a side thing. It's a lens that you use to approach every aspect of the work. So if we're not thinking about equity when we're creating compensation bands, when we're doing talent acquisition, when we're doing employee engagement, then there's probably something wrong with our model. And there's probably something that we're missing, and we're not being as strategic or as effective as a business as we could be if we haven't included that as part of our perspective. So Mark is right, like that work really started with knowing who we are and defining our company and cultural values, and then ensuring that those were made really transparent to all of our staff members, because if you don't know the rules of the game, you can never win. And so we wanted to ensure that all of our staff members understood what it meant to be successful at Mursion and what's important to us as an organization. And then from there, translate that into business objectives, priorities, things like performance reviews, comp analysis, and so on. So I'd say it starts from there of knowing why you're focused on what you're focused on, and then making sure that it's integrated into everything you do, as opposed to like a standalone project or like a training experience that lives outside of the day-to-day functions of the business.
That's super helpful. And I'm curious if we can then maybe get down into even more brass tacks and talk a little bit about how this work has evolved over time. So Mark, you've been in the role for 7 years. Sara, you've been there for 3 years. Can you talk about kind of when you picked up on this work, what was already in place, and then how did you build to it over time?
I'll go first, and I will end up throwing this ultimately over to Sara to characterize what was in the early days, the work here. Phase one, and this phase one of this was to address the outward appearance of our product. One of the first things we began building simulations for educators, and so our avatars were of children. And as you might imagine, there is enormous sensitivity to the risk of stereotyping children, and if in preparing teachers for this. And so in the very early days, that was one of the first things we attended to. And actually, in a collaboration with a large educational research organization, a national panel was convened to give us advice on how to do this. I do think like it takes lots of cycles to get this kind of thing right. So I don't want to suggest that work was ever done, and we're continuing to evolve that work. But because of the issues around children, a lot of our early staff, including Sara, came to us with a very deep background and knowledge around effective pedagogies in classrooms and cultural sensitivity around instruction. And so in the early days, there was actually a team of staff that on their own began work around talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion principles, values, how it would show up. It was a spontaneous effort. And while I was aware of it and supportive of it, I don't deserve the credit for leading it. I didn't do so. There were others. Sara was a member of the staff, she wasn't in her present role at the time. But there was an active group of people who met regularly and talked about these issues. And it was, at least for me, it was in seeing that work that it inspired me to elevate Sara to the role that she's in right now in leading everything about our people and culture. And then Sara should really tell the story from there, how the work matured from that place, because she has led it.
Sure. So also just to add on to what Mark said, I didn't start in a people and culture function. I actually started on our client experience side and was in that role. And through those informal networks, started to realize like what was important to the business and how can we elevate that and how do we make connections. But at that time, because it was before we had like a really clear articulated commitment to the why of DEI and B, as well as the what and the how. we had staff members who were, like one staff member here, another staff member there, sort of disparately thinking about or working on all these different issues. And when Mark made a very public commitment to us really focusing on diversity, it allowed us to really galvanize the work and rally around the fact that this was a business priority that Mark had made very clear to all of us was something that was worth investing our time in and was as important to the business as was hitting your OKRs or, like bringing in new revenue and that sort of a thing. So I think that the fact that we had a CEO who was public about his own commitment made it easier for the work to start taking off in more formal ways and in a more rapid fashion.
Yeah.
So we and we got there through then also actually getting Mark's support in being part of diversity, equity, and inclusion committees that had a very clear charge of we're defining our values, or today it's about looking at things like how are we attracting and retaining excellent racially diverse talent at this organization, or looking at things like what is our approach to scenario design and how do we ensure that we're mitigating as much risk for bias, both for our learners, but also for our delivery staff in those processes. And having Mark be at the table and then also pull other voices to the table, like mine, for instance, has been a way that we've been able to really push this work forward. But I think it does take executive sponsorship in order for work to move faster and for it to feel as important to everybody in the organization as other business priorities do.
That's great. And I think your last sentence there really underscores this theme that I'm hearing, right? Which is, yes, this work has been embedded in the organization's core values. There were a team of employees who really committed to starting to do the work. And then Mark's, elevation of that has helped to accelerate and really continue to embed it across the organization and across a variety of initiatives, which is great. My last question for you is just what advice would you give to other CEOs and leaders of organizations that are not as advanced yet as Mursion is on doing this work? Where would you encourage them to start? What approaches do you think are most effective and helpful?
I think given my first piece of advice would be given the intense polarization we see in our world today, that the thing I have most admired about the approach Sara and our internal committee overall has taken around this work is that it's squarely focused on inclusion and belonging. And so all of the nurturing of what it takes for people to feel heard, for their voice to matter, for them to feel supported and welcome, it is because it's a holistic process that you just don't, these various aspects of unconscious bias that we all have that we miss, where we inadvertently keep people out, I think has an enormous aspect. I mean, it isn't just, and I want to say, so it's not just about the numbers. Did we get this many people in the pipeline? Yes, we pay, in the right ways and all that. That's great. Those are yes, and I'm saying here, but that focus on belonging is my first piece of advice. My second piece of advice would be patience. Patience on two. I think there's a lot because of that point I made about the context in the world, because I do also think independent of the context in the world, there is something generationally going on that those of us who are on the boomer side of leadership still have not experienced, that we have to understand. People don't want to talk about this for the next decade. They want to see action. And we have to show a commitment to act. And we have to be patient with people who are bringing to the table a frustration that we're not used to experiencing around these kinds of conversations, and recognize the authentic place where that frustration comes from. Mm-hmm. And as I think is almost cliche now, recognizing that it's going to be real work for a long period of time. It's a journey, and we're all going to learn a lot, and it's good to just listen and learn for a while. That would be my advice.
Mm-hmm. To add one more thing too. It's not advice as a CEO, but I think it's something that I really respected in Mark as our CEO, is that he didn't wait for the message to be crystal and perfect and ready to be plastered in a billboard. And it wasn't that he only just like said that, but he was acting it in his day-to-day actions, in the way that he supported me as my manager, both like professionally, but also personally, and recognizing that I bring a lot of things to the table besides just being an HR professional, and recognizing my identity as a mom, as a Muslim woman, as a person of color, and honoring that in our management relationship. It gave me confidence that even if the message wasn't perfect, that we had the right people at the table and had the right sort of hearts in the work to be able to get it right eventually, even if it took multiple iterations. And I think a lot of people just wait to try and get it perfect before they start taking action. And by the time you do that, you're so far behind the starting line that you have to come up with an entirely new plan. So I think just taking action, even if you don't have it perfect, but bringing the right people to help you get it perfect into the conversation is really important.
That's great. And a great note to end on. I mean, the words that I heard in both of your responses were focus on belonging, be patient in this work, but also, to your point, Sara, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. We need to make forward progress. And I think the two things I would add are you both clearly bring humility to the work and authentic, sincere desire to make progress. And I would imagine those are critical components as well. Thank you both so much for your time today. I think the companies that are taking the IDEAL12 will have a lot to learn from your approach and hopefully feel inspired to take action as well. So thank you both.